In June 2020, on a quiet street in one of Mexico City's wealthiest neighborhoods, a convoy carrying Omar García Harfuch was surrounded by a dozen gunmen armed with assault rifles and grenades. They opened fire with .50 caliber weapons. Hundreds of rounds tore through the vehicles. 2 of his bodyguards were killed instantly. A young woman driving nearby on her way to sell street food was caught in the crossfire and died on the pavement. Harfuch took 3 bullets, 1 in the arm, 1 in the shoulder, 1 in the leg. From his hospital bed, still bleeding, he posted a message identifying the attackers. They were the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, acting on direct orders from its leader, a man most of the world had never heard of. His name was Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes. The cartel world knew him as El Mencho. 6 years later, Harfuch got his answer. On February 22, 2026, Mexican Special Forces descended on a gated residential compound in the mountain town of Tapalpa, Jalisco, roughly 90 kilometers south of Guadalajara. Inside was the most wanted man in Mexico and one of the most wanted fugitives in the United States, with a $15 million bounty on his head. The operation that followed would kill El Mencho, ignite violence across half the country, and set the stage for one of the most surreal funerals in the history of organized crime. But to understand how this story reached that cemetery in Zapopan, you need to understand who El Mencho actually was. Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes was born on July 17, 1966, in a tiny village called Naranjo de Chila in the municipality of Aguililla, deep in the Tierra Caliente region of Michoacán. His family were avocado farmers. He dropped out of school before finishing primary education. There was no indication that this boy from one of the poorest corners of Western Mexico would someday run a criminal empire with an estimated $50 billion in assets. In the 1980s, he crossed illegally into the United States and settled in California. He was arrested for heroin distribution, convicted, and sentenced to 3 years in federal prison. After serving his time, he was deported. He came back. He was arrested again. Deported again. When he returned to Mexico for good, he briefly worked as a police officer in Jalisco. That career did not last. He drifted into the orbit of the Milenio Cartel, a regional drug trafficking organization run by the Valencia family. And then, in 2009 and 2010, as the Milenio Cartel collapsed under government pressure, El Mencho and a partner named Eric Valencia Salazar saw their opportunity. They built a new organization from the wreckage. They called it the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, the Jalisco New Generation Cartel. What happened next was one of the fastest criminal expansions in Mexican history. Within a few years, the CJNG went from a regional splinter group to a paramilitary operation with roughly 5,000 armed fighters, a fleet of armored vehicles, explosive-equipped drones, and smuggling routes reaching into all 50 American states. They controlled ports, they ran methamphetamine labs, they trafficked cocaine, heroin, and increasingly, fentanyl. The United States Drug Enforcement Administration estimated that El Mencho's organization was responsible for moving at least 1/3 of all illegal drugs entering the United States by air and sea. El Mencho's approach was different from other cartel bosses. While El Chapo Guzman had cultivated a public persona and eventually became a kind of folk anti-hero, El Mencho stayed invisible. No interviews, no photographs for years. He lived modestly compared to other kingpins, moving constantly through the mountains of Jalisco and Michoacán, surrounded by ex-military bodyguards who formed concentric rings of security, an inner circle of armed escorts, an outer circle of lookouts who monitored roads, communications, and police movements around the clock. But invisibility did not mean restraint. In 2015, the CJNG shot down a Mexican military helicopter. They ambushed police convoys. They hung bodies from overpasses. They firebombed gas stations. And in that June 2020 attack on Paseo de la Reforma in Mexico City, they sent a clear message to every law enforcement official in the country. Harfuch survived. Many others did not. So when Mexican intelligence finally got a break in February 2026, the operation had to be airtight. On February 20th, surveillance teams identified a trusted associate of one of El Mencho's romantic partners. They tracked the associate as he transported the woman to a residence inside the Tapalpa Country Club, an upscale gated development in the forested highlands. The woman met with El Mencho at the property and left the following day. He stayed behind with a security detail of roughly 10 bodyguards. The planning began immediately. By dawn on February 22nd, special forces from the Mexican Army, the Air Force, and the National Guard Immediate Reaction Special Force had established a perimeter. 6 helicopters provided air support. Ground troops advanced on foot to avoid alerting cartel lookouts. When the soldiers reached the compound, they were met with heavy fire. Cartel gunmen used high-caliber rifles and rocket launchers. One military helicopter was struck and forced to make an emergency landing. In the chaos, El Mencho and several bodyguards fled into the surrounding forest, triggering a second firefight among the trees. When soldiers finally reached him, El Mencho had been hit multiple times. He had bullet wounds to the chest, the abdomen, and both legs. He was loaded onto an aircraft bound for Mexico City, but he never made it. The official time of death was recorded at 10:30 that morning. 8 cartel members were killed in the operation, and 2 more were detained. Defense Secretary Ricardo Trevilla confirmed that the United States had provided intelligence support that helped locate the compound. The White House confirmed the same, and then the country caught fire. Within hours of the news breaking, CJNG launched coordinated reprisals across more than 20 of Mexico's 32 states. Cartel members hijacked buses, cargo trucks, and private vehicles, setting them ablaze to block highways and urban roads. In the Guadalajara metropolitan area alone, dozens of roadblocks paralyzed the city. Gas stations were torched, storefronts burned. Gunfire echoed through neighborhoods that normally felt safe. Videos from the Guadalajara airport showed passengers sprinting through terminals as flights were canceled. Smoke rose over Puerto Vallarta. Schools were closed across several states the following Monday. Public transit was suspended in Jalisco. The governor activated a state of emergency protocol. By Monday morning, 25 National Guard members had been killed in 6 separate attacks across Jalisco. Security analysts identified a senior CJNG figure, known as El Tuli, as the organizer of the retaliation. Authorities said he offered a bounty of roughly $1,100 for every soldier killed. Later that same day, Mexican forces tracked El Tuli to the town of El Grulo, about 180 kilometers southwest of Guadalajara. He tried to run. He opened fire. He was killed. The violence carried a message that extended far beyond grief. This was a display of organizational power. It was a demonstration that even with the boss dead, the machine could still grind. For many analysts, it raised an uncomfortable question about what happens next. Through all of this, Harfuch stood at the center of the government's response. Omar García Harfuch is not a typical bureaucrat. He was born in 1982 in Cuernavaca. His grandfather, General Marcelino García Barragan, served as Mexico's Secretary of National Defense. His father, Javier García Paniagua, led the Federal Security Directorate and served as president of the PRY, Mexico's dominant political party for most of the 20th century. Harfuch joined the federal police in 2008 and rose quickly. By 2019, he was Mexico City's chief of police under Mayor Claudia Sheinbaum. His tenure was effective. Homicide rates in the capital dropped by roughly 40%. When Sheinbaum became president in October 2024, she appointed Harfuch as the country's Secretary of Security and Civilian Protection, the top security post in the federal government. Since taking that role, Harfuch has overseen the arrest of more than 37,000 suspects in high-impact crimes, the seizure of over 300 tons of drugs, and the dismantling of more than 600 drug laboratories. He was also central to the capture of Ryan Wedding, the former Olympic snowboarder turned international drug trafficker, who was apprehended in Mexico City in January 2026. The media started calling him Mexico's Batman. The CJNG called him a target, which brings us to the funeral. On February 28th, the Attorney General's office released El Mencho's body to his family at the Federal Forensic Center in Mexico City. The death certificate confirmed what officials had already stated publicly: gunshot wounds to the chest, abdomen, and lower limbs. The body was transported first to the J. Garcia Lopez funeral home in the upscale Juarez neighborhood of the capital, and then, under armed convoy, to Guadalajara. On Sunday, March 1st, the wake began at Funeraria La Paz, a funeral home in the San Andres neighborhood of Guadalajara. From early morning, dozens of military vehicles surrounded the building. Soldiers from the Mexican Army, the National Guard, and state police formed a visible perimeter. A military helicopter circled overhead. The scene was unlike anything most residents had ever witnessed. Access was tightly restricted. Every person entering was searched by federal agents. And yet, throughout the day, flower arrangements kept arriving. Dozens of wreaths, most without any card or signature. A few carried the same anonymous dedication, from a family that will always be grateful. One arrangement stood out from the rest, a monumental floral sculpture in the shape of a rooster, crafted from red and white roses, with the letters CJNG displayed across the top. The rooster was a direct reference to El Mencho's other nickname, El Señor de los Gallos, the Lord of the Roosters. Every arrangement was inspected by soldiers before being allowed inside. The burial took place the following day, Monday, March 2nd, at the Recinto de la Paz Cemetery in Zapopan, a suburb of Guadalajara. The casket was golden. A banda, a traditional Mexican brass ensemble, played regional music as the procession made its way through the grounds. Dozens of mourners followed, many carrying black umbrellas under a bright sun. The Attorney General's office refused to confirm the burial location, citing security concerns. A federal official spoke to the Associated Press on condition of anonymity. For the Mexican government, the funeral was more than a ceremonial endpoint. According to intelligence assessments, cartel funerals have historically doubled as strategic meetings. When a leader dies, the lieutenants gather not just to mourn, but to negotiate succession, divide territory, and reassign control of distribution routes. The military presence at the funeral was not merely protective, it was intelligence collection in real time. And then there was the discovery that may have mattered more than the killing itself. Inside El Mencho's hideout in Tapalpa, investigators recovered a trove of handwritten documents, accounting ledgers, payroll records, lists of names, amounts, and assignments. The media quickly dubbed them the narco nomina, the narco payroll. According to reports from El Universal, the documents detailed the Jalisco New Generation Cartel's operational spending across multiple municipalities in Jalisco, payments to gunmen, salaries for lookouts known as halcones, fees for extortion operators, and most critically, bribes directed at municipal police officers, state police, and even members of the National Guard. Harfuch addressed the discovery publicly during a press conference in Mazatlan on February 27. He confirmed that the Attorney General's office was investigating the documents and that authorities had already opened inquiries into police officers and other local officials suspected of ties to the cartel. He was careful to note that no politicians had been implicated so far, but he left the door wide open, stating that any evidence pointing to any public servant would be pursued. The narconomina is significant because it represents something investigators rarely obtain: a direct window into a cartel's financial architecture. Who gets paid, how much, how often, and who inside the government was cooperating. With El Mencho dead and his inner circle shattered, the question now consuming security analysts on both sides of the border is straightforward. Who takes over? Harfuch stated publicly that the government had identified 4 leaders within the CJNG considered strong enough to assume command. He did not reveal names, but security analysts and media outlets quickly assembled a short list. El Mencho's stepson, Juan Carlos Valencia Gonzalez, known by several aliases including L03 and El Pelon, is widely considered the frontrunner. He is 41 years old and was born in California. His biological mother is El Mencho's wife, Rosalinda Gonzalez Valencia, whose family, known as Los Quines, managed much of the cartel's money laundering across Latin America. Other names circulating include Hugo Gonzalo Mendoza Gaitan, known as El Sapo, and Audias Flores Silva, known as El Jardinero, along with Ricardo Ruiz Velasco, called El Doble R, and Heraclio Guerrero Martinez, known as El Tio Laco. All are reportedly under investigation. The danger is not just about who takes charge, it is about what happens during the transition. When El Chapo Guzman was arrested in 2016, the Sinaloa cartel eventually fractured into warring factions. That internal conflict, which intensified dramatically in 2024 and 2025 after the arrest of Ismael El Mayo Zambada, turned the state of Sinaloa into one of the most violent places in the Western Hemisphere. If the same pattern repeats with the CJNG, the consequences could be even worse. The CJNG has a presence in at least 28 Mexican states. Their operations extend into Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Central America. A succession war inside the Jalisco cartel would not be contained within a single state. It would ripple across the continent and into American cities where the CJNG already has distribution networks. And all of this is unfolding just months before the 2026 FIFA World Cup, with Guadalajara scheduled to host 4 group stage matches at Estadio Akron starting in June. El Mencho's story, from avocado fields in rural Michoacán to a golden casket in Zapopan, is not the story of one man. It is the story of what happens when poverty, corruption, and an insatiable demand for drugs in the world's largest consumer market collide over decades. The system that produced him is still running. The routes are still active. The customers are still buying. Subscribe for more investigative breakdowns like this one.